I will begin with a word of thanks to social science research community for having given me the opportunity of speaking on a book which I have literally seen taking birth in front of my eyes. Uh, Akhil was constantly in touch with me and he came up with his novel arguments. He had shown his earlier drafts, and I must express my deep sense of happiness that finally the book has come out and I have been invited to speak on the book. So, congratulations, Akhil. Uh, Let me see how I propose to read the book. I read it as one that offers deep insights into our understanding of the tectonic shifts that have uh, taken place in recent decades in the art of governing the people in general, and Assam in particular. I fully agree with Professor Anupama Ray when she says that the book has its general implications. I guess that Professor Palshikar has also framed the same argument in a comparative perspective. Uh, so I will basically focus on how election could be a way of governing people, of what you could do by way of leveraging elections. The book prompts me to ask if it is possible to see elections playing a vital role in governing the people. Could the title of the book be How Elections Govern the People? For elections have hitherto been viewed as a democratic means of governing those who govern us, whether by selecting them or keeping them under a leash and holding them accountable to those who elect them. So that's the democratic framework. The book forces me to view elections as a technology of governing the people. While much is being said about the problem of evolving, modifying, calibrating, refining, and thus improving the means so that people may exercise ever greater and more effective control over the governors with a slew of electoral reforms, correspondingly much less, if at all, is written on how people are transformed into an object of government through instrumentality of elections. This is how I plan to read the book. This will take us beyond the conventional path of understanding democracies charted out by the textbooks we grew up with, to the way, for instance, the people are reduced to the numbers of an electorate, how they are organized and classified into constituencies, how constituencies are gerrymandered and delimited, how voters are enlisted, how their names are dropped from the voters list, a phenomenon variously known as scientific rigging in West Bengal or as de-voters in Assam and so forth, how the electorate is mobilized and how campaigns are conducted. In short, how the people are constituted as subjects by the very act of election and so forth. The book thus has the potential of turning around one of the founding assumptions of liberal democratic architecture, which says that voters already constituted as political subjects go to the polling booth and cast their votes while exercising their right to franchise, otherwise considered as the mainstay of democracy. What we argue is that elections become a technology by which people's subjectivities are shaped and constituted. There are no a priori political subjects existing prior to the elections. They become subjects only in and through elections. Let us explain the point by way of trying to unpack the otherwise complicated relationship between ethnicity and elections in Assam. One cannot stop referring to ethnicity as one seeks to make sense of the political region. The central question is how ethnicities are sought to be governed and managed through elections for the convenience, within quotes, of governing the people. One way of explaining it is to argue that people vote along given ethnic lines. Subjectivities being uniquely ethnic in a country like India, and more so in a region like the Northeast, are formed along ethnic lines. And electoral outcomes only reflect the given ethnic composition of the particular society in which it is held. Sylhet referendum of 1947 may be regarded as the originary moment of post-colonial Assam. According to Amalendu Guha, who is Assam's premier historian, the outcome of the referendum exactly coincided with the communal composition of the district's voters, and Sylhet, predominantly a Bengali-speaking district, was thus pushed into the then East Bengal as a walkover to Assam Pradesh Congress Committee, walkover by the Assam Pradesh Congress Committee. So once undivided Assam had witnessed enough of the struggle for acquiring and retaining the majority status by the Assamese-speaking elite, by getting rid of the areas where the majority status of the community is either fragile or simply non-existent. A book published sometime in the early 1960s, and this was in Assamese, entitled Okhomia, I forgot the name of the author, for instance, raises the question of why Assam should not have remained satisfied with only the erstwhile 4 districts of Upper Assam, where the Assamese have a comfortably stable majority. Many of today's problems would not have emerged at all. When electoral outcomes reiterate ethnic composition, it is the ethnic majority that calls the shots, and ethnocracy masquerades as democracy. Election, as a result, ceases to have the kind of significance that was once attached to it by such theoreticians of representative democracy as John Stuart Mill and others. Mill was stoutly arguing for organizing democracy within a flat and mononational template, which according to him will rule out the rise of ethnocracy. He of course did not use the term, and organize the electorate in a way that would enable it to put up a joint resistance to the tyrant rulers. So that's why he said that democracy goes well with a mononational state. But what the Israeli geographers call ethnocracy has its different connotation in Assam. Assam is not Israel. The society in Assam is irreducibly plural, and winning elections here throws up the challenge of governing the very plurality of the society. And this book depicts tellingly how the plurality is to be governed, how the plurality has been governed. Territorial reorganization does not seem any longer to be an option in the region as it used to be, the last being Arunachal Pradesh way back in 1987. The book, as I read it, tells us the story of how the plurality is governed through elections in the present scenario. A great change has occurred in this regard. AGP perhaps could not have understood the importance of leveraging elections for bringing about the social transformation. And that's where I would make a distinction between AGP and BJP. It could understand politics, AGP could understand politics, but it could not recognize the necessary agenda of social transformation. BJP has understood the necessity of bringing about appropriate social transformation or rebooting the social template. AGP took the society in Assam for granted and faced trouble. Let us take 1985 election as an example. The Assam movement has just come to an end, and AGP has come to power, reportedly riding on the huge popularity wave of the Assam movement. If one were to demystify the numbers, AGP, even at its heyday, could not muster more than 35% of total votes polled in the election. It could come to power precisely because the opposition votes were divided. Another significant point is that AGP could not win a single seat wherever Muslims could constitute 25% or more of the population and could bag only half of the assembly seats. I might be somewhere erratic in remembering the numbers, but numbers would be close to the reality. Besides territorial reorganization, keeping the opposition divided by way of shaping and aligning the political forces could serve as a tool of governing the people in the region. One can do it either by keeping others divided, as it happened in 1985, or by way of building alliances across ethnicities, as it happened about a decade later in 1996. The 1991 elections, which AGP lost, were an eye-opener for AGP in the sense that it was voted out of power insofar as the opposition forces joined hands and closed ranks with each other. AGP came to realize the irreducible plurality of the society in Assam only in 1996 and joined hands with those forces that were once vociferously opposed to the Assam movement. This was complemented by AGP's strategy of slowly dumping the demands of the Assam movement by the wayside and quietly distancing itself from the movement's ideology. The Liberal Democrats would certainly heave a sigh of relief. They would rather take it as the growing maturity of our democracy. For such alliances across ethnic divide and distancing from narrow ethnicist demands would gradually propel de-ethnicization of the society and leave space for the play of individual subjectivities let loose from their ethnic allegiances. The existing literature on elections in Assam is of course marked by this liberal expectancy. And I'm sorry to say that much of what is written on Indian elections is marked by this liberal expectancy, whether you have the thesis of second democratic upsurge or India's second electoral revolution, so on and so forth. Elections are expected to bring about this social transition from ethnically loaded electoral majority to an electoral majority that is what Sheldon Wolin would have called vacuous and emptied of its ethnic essence. The elections of 1996, I will argue, could have been an opportunity for AGP to create a rainbow society in tune with the AGP-led multi-ethnic political alliance. So at one level, at the political level, it was building up alliances, but it was unmindful of the kind of social transformation that it was required to bring about. AGP could only accomplish the political task of building alliances across ethnic divisions without correspondingly undertaking the social task of creating what Akhil might call a rainbow society. AGP was caught in a conundrum whether to create a society of the Assamese people, clause 6 of the Assam Accord, or a society for the people living in Assam. Assam in that sense is a governor's nightmare. For governing Assam calls for the uphill task of rendering the society governable in the first place, literally by altering its demographics. The task of using elections as a means of altering the social fabric in order eventually to influence the electoral outcomes was still unknown to AGP. Akhil's book in that sense is unique, for it portrays how saffron is etched deep and wide in the very fabric of the society. Neither Congress nor AGP was cut out for the job. The book shows cogently how Hindutva in power is also an agenda of social transformation. BJP could accomplish in the second decade of this century what AGP could not during its two reigns between 1985 and 1990, and again between 1996 and 2001. The challenge today is not so much to make government democratic, but to govern democracy itself, constitute people's subjectivities, bring the demos into existence in the first place, and render them governable. Let us call this body an electoral community, a community that is constructed at the beck and call of elections, that comes into being in and through elections. It is not ethnocracy of the Israeli type. Insofar as this electoral community is produced by elections, what about those who resolutely refuse to be identified with it and stay away from elections? And today we fondly remember, we remember that the classical divide between the elections and insurgency, I think, has disappeared. Staying away from elections, I will argue, is integral to the electoral game. And so-called oppositional subjectivities are also framed through the instrumentality of elections. One of the enigmas that never stop puzzling us is between 1952 and 1978, the six consecutively held assembly elections 45% of the voters on an average did not participate in voting in Assam. By contrast, according to the Hindu, since 1961, there have been as many as 41 elections in India in which the voting turnout was 80% or above, out of which 30 had taken place in the Northeast. Why do people vote with their feet up in the air in a region which has acquired the notoriety of being turbulent and prone to insurgencies and violence? It is because an electoral community has come into being that spills across the conventional divide between elections and insurgencies. This again goes against the very grain of our textbook habit of making a surgically precise distinction between elections and insurgencies. I think our concept of the production of electoral community will help us understand the fraught nature of ethnic relations and the nexus between elections and insurgency. In 1996 elections, for instance, which I had the opportunity of studying a bit closely, the commands of an insurgent organization, Alpha, played a significant role in setting forth the election agenda of the political parties contesting it. In this election, the same organization asked each of the contesting political parties to clarify its stand on the issue of foreign nationals. In many constituencies, it would actively back up candidates known for their closeness to the insurgents. So I come to the concluding part. Is this the end of the road for democracy then? The growing depreciation of elections is also accompanied by a visible expansion of democracy outside its institutional limits. Akhil's earlier works, I read Akhil in totality because he has not only written this book, but he has other books as well, which I had the opportunity of reading and reviewing. Akhil's earlier works on human security and civil society point out how the democratic space has exceeded the institutional contours of elections and their corollaries. While we know that law is made by the legislative bodies authorized to make them, one cannot but notice how Kisan Sansad sessions are held, for instance, on the outskirts of Delhi. There are multiple points of lawmaking in the society, and legislative bodies are only one of them. In the words of an old agitating farmer, quote, Kanun Sarak Padi Banta, unquote. I am particularly drawn to Akhil's use of the phrase, and I raise this point with a sense of trepidation because some of my co-panelists might not agree with me. The subtitle is Saffron in the Rainbow. Mark this word in. Does it mean that the rainbow loses its multicolored nature and melts into the saffron, a phenomenon known as saffronization? Does ethnic polarization threaten to repapper the society of Assam? Claude Leffer argues that liberal democratic theory does not have an answer to this question because it's essentially inherently disintegrating. Any functioning democracy faces the threat of being dismembered as a result of this divide, ethnic divide, inherent in it. Ankur Tamuli Fukan, who is present here and who is participating in the audience, and I had the opportunity of reading his yet unpublished ethnographies on 2021 elections in Assam, the last election held. It provides an opportunity, an ample testimony to how elections this year were fought on extremely local issues. Now, he, for instance, argues that you see elderly women taking out a procession in Sibsagar, but you don't see the same women coming out and taking out a procession elsewhere. He gives the example of a remote village of Assam on the Assam-Nagaland border, where a family votes being influenced by how the BJP is in alliance in the state of Nagaland rather than in Assam. So much depends on whatever is happening in Nagaland and how your vote is influenced. So you can say that this is an extremely fragmented kind of election. At one level, it needs to be explained how all such local issues are woven together within the rubric of Hindutva. And the Ethnographic work in question, like all other ethnographic works, has a tendency of missing the woods for the trees. To say that it is saffronization of an otherwise rainbow society is an oversimplification. Borrowing from the title of Akhil's book, I would say it is not so much saffron displacing the rainbow, but saffron skillfully positioning itself within the rainbow without wiping out any of its colors. Gautam Bhadra, the subaltern historian, once described BJP as a hydra-headed entity. Akhil's book offers a clue to understand how the saffron penetrates into the societies of the Northeast. Is it saffronization of the rainbow or the saffron in the rainbow? After all, we have to understand why cow slaughter is not an issue in Meghalaya. Is it not true that Hindutva rearticulates itself within the rainbow? And one has to explain how Hindutva reaches out to other and unfamiliar social constituencies of the Northeast and recreates itself in the process. Thank you.